In this video, I'm building a Walnut Communion Table for a local church and learning a valuable lesson about planning ahead. A local church reached out to see if I could build them a custom communion table, cross, and lectern for their new sanctuary. I gave them some wood samples and a few rough sketches, and after careful consideration, they chose the beautiful but classic look of solid walnut for all three pieces in the set. And I love planing down walnut. The process of watching rough cut lumber go in one side and the beautiful grain patterns come out on the other is extremely satisfying. Once it's all clean, I line these up to get a good look at the grain pattern for the tabletop. I wanted to find patterns that match for the glue up so that the top looks nice and cohesive and with as little disruption from the joinery as possible. As you can see, these boards are pretty bowed, so after finding a pattern I thought would work, I need to get them straightened out and ready to glue together. To do that, I like to use a long straight edge like this 6-foot metal ruler, or the Craig AccuCut XL track to find the ideal cut to conserve as much usable material as possible. At this point, I just need to get one side of the board nice and straight as a reference edge. Then I use that reference edge for a parallel cut on the table saw. That gives me two straight edges I can now use to square up the boards. The jointer makes sure any final inconsistencies on the edges are flattened so that there's a nice smooth surface for the glue joints. I don't have a Festool domino.
Well, that's something which you'll have to remedy, isn't it?
So to keep everything straight during this glue up, I'm using a biscuit joiner. These are relatively inexpensive alternatives and are pretty useful for lighter duty applications. They just don't have the shear strength of something like a domino because the biscuits themselves are thinner. I'm using enough biscuits here and plan to have numerous attachment points to the base, so separation should not be a problem. Once the glue had dried, I removed the clamps and started the process of flattening and squaring the top of the table. For the flattening process, I used the jig I made in my most recent slab table video, only with 2-inch risers instead of the 4-inch ones. I stupidly forgot to remove the tape, however, which created a little more sanding work for me later. Also, this thing makes a huge mess, and I have yet to find a good dust collector attachment for the Ryobi. If you have any suggestions, drop them down in the comments. The tabletop was just the right width to run through the drum sander and knock down the bulk of the lines from the router. And I finished off the rest with the orbital sander using 80 grit discs. To square the ends, I used this T-square to mark a straight line. Then measured the distance between the blade and the edge of the saw's shoe and clamped a metal straight edge that same distance from the line. Then I could just run the saw down that edge to ensure as straight a cut as possible on both sides. There were a couple cracks and knots on the bottom that I wanted to fix before moving on. So I flipped it over and I filled those with CA glue and accelerator. These are such time savers and really look great once they're sanded down. Then I added a 45-degree decorative chamfer at the bottom edge to wrap up top preparations. I don't want this table to look like it skips leg day, so I need to do some more glue ups to give them some bulk. I ripped a few boards down to 3 inches wide and cut them to length, leaving a little extra wiggle room in case something goes wrong. Then I take a few minutes to match up the grains and colors to minimize areas where the seams will be really noticeable before running them over the jointer and getting them glued and clamped. Once removed from the clamps, I can run them over the jointer again, but this time on all 4 sides to get them dimensioned correctly. This takes multiple passes and stopping to measure throughout on each leg. But once they're all the same, I cut them to their final lengths on the miter saw, gave the side edges a 1/2 inch round over, and pre-sanded down to 120. Now to tie them all together and make a stable base. To do that, I'd planned to create a thick 5-inch skirt around the top and 3-inch stretchers around the bottom, with an H stretcher in the middle, all connected by mortise and tenon joints. I'm still quite new at mortise and tenon joints and not very good at it at all, so they're a lot of extra work for me. In fact, I spent an entire day with a chisel cleaning up these tenons, trying to get them dialed in exactly. I did splurge and get a mortiser though for a recent build as an incentive to keep practicing and improving. I ran some test fits to make sure everything worked as expected and was almost ready for the final glue up, except for one missing piece. Almost every communion table has some variation of this phrase written on it, but unfortunately, my CNC wasn't wide enough to cut it. So I reached out to a couple of talented local woodworkers who graciously donated some time on their shop saver to help me out. With the front skirt in hand, I was ready to start assembling the table. I decided it would be a good idea to glue up the legs and side stretchers first, then lay them on a known flat surface to ensure they were 100% parallel for the final glue up. This worked out great, and at least halved the amount of chaos that was about to descend on my shop. If you're familiar with my content, you know I don't mind showing when I screw up. This is one of those moments. Because in the days leading up to this assembly, not once did it occur to me that I don't own a single clamp that will reach both ends of this table. But here I go dumping glue in the mortises anyway. When I finally realized, as glue was running everywhere, I grabbed my band clamps thinking they'll hold up in a pinch. Except the bands and the band clamps weren't long enough either. But as I ran through options, I remembered I had a box of ratchet straps, and they looked to be the same width as the band clamps. So I used a couple of those in the band clamp base, and it worked, but not as good as I'd hoped. So, to unscrew this screw up, I decided to use screws. I drilled some countersink holes, and then pre-drilled for the screws, because the last thing I need at this point would be to make it worse. In the end, though, I think this was a good move, because it really tightened everything up perfect. I cut plugs from scraps and filled up the countersink holes. Wherever possible, I matched the color as close as I could and always made sure the plugs are following the surrounding grain patterns. Then I saw them flush with a handsaw and sand them down. Because they'll be moving this table in and out of the sanctuary a lot, and likely picking it up by the top, I want to make sure it's extremely well secured. So I'm going to use these figure-8 washers all around the skirt, then countersink some 3-inch screws straight into the legs at the 4 corners. The figure-8 washers are pretty amazing and extremely useful. You just use a Forstner bit to drill down the depth of the washer, attach it on one side with a downward screw, and on the other with an upward screw. Easy breezy. Now I can lift the top onto the base, center it, and get it secured. And for the final details, I used the shaper to cut the custom profile trim they requested and attached it to the table with a pin nailer. Then, I added a slight chamfer to the top edge. After sanding everything down to 180 grit, I sprayed 4 coats of General Finishes High Performance Gloss on this table. For the last 2 coats, I lightly sanded all surfaces with 220 and 330 grit sponges before spraying. And since this table is at high risk for moisture and grape juice stains, I applied 2 coats of N3 Nano Hard Coat, waited 24 hours, and applied 2 coats of their top coat. I've had great success with this stuff so far, and applying it to this table should ensure that it stays stain-free and moisture-wicking for years to come. And that's how I built this simple, modern take on the communion table. Check out the description for links to the rest of the series, along with tools and materials used in this build. And consider joining my Patreon for more frequent updates and input on future projects. Thanks so much for watching.